What school nurse's decision should have landed them in prison? I got the call from Oak Ridge Elementary at 1:15 on a Thursday afternoon. My son Caleb was in the nurse's office complaining of stomach pain. The secretary's voice was casual, almost bored. She said Nurse Thornton wanted me to know Caleb was asking to go home, but she didn't think it was necessary. Just some lunch that didn't agree with him. I asked to speak with Caleb directly. The secretary put me on hold for 2 minutes before coming back to say he was in the bathroom, and Nurse Thornton said he'd be fine to finish the school day. Something in my gut twisted. Caleb was 9 years old and had never once faked being sick to get out of school. He loved school, loved his teacher Mrs. Yates and his best friend Desmond, and the solar system project they were working on. I told the secretary I was coming to get him anyway. She sighed like I was being one of those overprotective parents and said she'd let the office know. The drive to Oak Ridge took 12 minutes. I used every one of them trying to convince myself I was overreacting, that the secretary was right and I was being paranoid, but I'd learned to trust my instincts after Caleb's older sister Mira had appendicitis 2 years ago. The pediatrician had said it was just constipation, told us to give her prune juice and wait it out. 6 hours later, we were in the emergency room with a ruptured appendix and a surgeon telling us we'd almost lost her. Ever since then, I didn't ignore my gut when it came to my kid's health. I pulled into the school parking lot and grabbed my phone. No missed calls, no updates. I walked through the front entrance and signed in at the desk. The secretary barely looked up. She handed me a visitor badge and pointed down the hallway toward the nurse's office. Room 104. The door was closed. I knocked and waited. Nurse Thornton opened it after a long pause. She was maybe 55 with short gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. Her expression was irritated before she even saw me. She asked if I was Caleb's father and I said yes. She stepped back to let me in. The office was small and sterile. White walls, fluorescent lights, a desk covered in paperwork, an examination table with paper covering, and Caleb. He was lying on his side on a vinyl couch against the wall, knees pulled up to his chest. His face was pale and sweaty. The moment he saw me, his eyes filled with tears. Dad. His voice cracked. It hurts so bad. I crossed the room and knelt next to him. Where does it hurt? He pointed to his lower right abdomen, the same spot Mira had pointed to. Nurse Thornton stood by her desk, with her arms crossed. I told you he was being dramatic. He's been complaining all afternoon, but his temperature is normal and he hasn't thrown up. It's probably just gas or anxiety about the math test tomorrow. I looked at Caleb's face, at the way he was holding himself perfectly still like any movement would make the pain worse. This wasn't anxiety. This wasn't gas. I asked Nurse Thornton if she'd checked for rebound tenderness. She blinked at me. That's not a standard assessment for stomach complaints in a school setting. I don't have the training or authorization to perform diagnostic procedures. I told her I wanted to take Caleb to the hospital. She said that was unnecessary and would disrupt his education, that parents always assumed the worst when their children had minor ailments, that she'd seen thousands of students over her 23 years as a school nurse and knew when something was serious. This wasn't serious. I didn't argue. I just helped Caleb sit up. He whimpered and clutched his stomach. I got him to his feet and he leaned against me, barely able to walk. Nurse Thornton followed us to the door. She said she'd mark him as an early dismissal, but that I was making a mistake, that I was teaching him that complaining got him special treatment, that this kind of coddling was why kids these days couldn't handle any discomfort. I turned and looked at her. My son is in pain, real pain, and you're more concerned about your professional opinion than his welfare. She stiffened. I'm concerned about not enabling attention-seeking behavior. I'm concerned about not wasting emergency room resources on stomach aches that resolve with Tums and time. I didn't respond. I just walked Caleb out of that office and down the hallway. He moved like every step cost him. The emergency room was 7 minutes away. Caleb cried in the passenger seat the entire drive. I tried to distract him by talking about his solar system project and what planet he was working on. He couldn't focus enough to answer, just kept saying, "It hurts, Dad. It hurts so much." I pulled up to the ER entrance, and a nurse met us with a wheelchair. Caleb practically fell into it. Inside, the triage nurse took one look at him and called for immediate assessment. They wheeled him back within 5 minutes. A young doctor named Dr. Kapoor examined him, asked him questions, pressed gently on his abdomen. Caleb screamed when she touched the lower right quadrant. Dr. Kapoor's face went serious. She ordered blood work and a CT scan immediately. Said the presentation was classic for appendicitis, possibly already ruptured based on the severity of his pain and how long he'd been symptomatic. They took Caleb for the CT scan while I waited in a small consultation room. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I called my wife Asha, who was at work 40 minutes away, told her what was happening. She said she'd leave immediately. I called my mother to pick up Mira from her school. Then I just sat there, staring at the white walls and replaying Nurse Thornton's words. This wasn't serious. Just gas or anxiety. Don't enable attention-seeking behavior. If she was wrong, if this was appendicitis, if it had ruptured because she'd kept him at school, I couldn't finish the thought. Dr. Kapoor came back 30 minutes later with a tablet showing Caleb's CT images. She pointed to a swollen, inflamed appendix. Definitely appendicitis. And yes, it had already ruptured. There was free fluid in his abdomen, indicating peritonitis. They needed to operate immediately. The surgery took 2 hours. The pediatric surgeon, Dr. Okonkwo, came out looking exhausted. He said they'd removed what was left of the appendix and cleaned out the infection as best they could, but the rupture had happened hours ago, long enough that the contamination had spread throughout Caleb's abdominal cavity. He'd need to stay in the hospital for at least a week on IV antibiotics. There was a significant risk of complications: abscess formation, sepsis, bowel obstruction. They'd be monitoring him closely. I asked when the appendix had ruptured. Dr. Okonkwo checked his notes. Based on the inflammation and fluid buildup, probably around noon, 6 hours ago. Right around the time Caleb had first gone to the nurse's office. Right around the time Nurse Thornton had decided he was being dramatic and kept him at school. Asha arrived while Caleb was in recovery. I told her everything. About the call from school. About Nurse Thornton's dismissal. About the ruptured appendix and the peritonitis. She went very still. That nurse kept him there for 6 hours with a ruptured appendix? I nodded. Asha's hands curled into fists. We need to report this. This is medical negligence. I agreed, but right then all I cared about was Caleb. They moved him to a pediatric surgical floor around 9 that night. He was groggy from anesthesia and pain medication, but awake enough to recognize us. Mom, Dad. His voice was small and scared. We sat on either side of his bed and held his hands. The nurse came in to check his vitals and adjust his IV. She was kind and gentle. Everything Nurse Thornton hadn't been. She explained that he'd need to stay still and let the antibiotics do their work. That he might feel worse before he felt better because infection was tricky. But they'd keep him comfortable. I didn't sleep that night. Asha dozed in the recliner chair while I sat next to Caleb's bed watching the monitors. His temperature spiked to 102 around 3 in the morning. The nurse came in and gave him additional medication. By morning, his fever had dropped to 99, but he looked gray and exhausted. Dr. Okonkwo came by during rounds and examined him, said his white blood cell count was elevated, which was expected with peritonitis. They'd repeat labs in the afternoon. He asked Caleb how he was feeling. Caleb said his stomach hurt, but not as bad as yesterday. Dr. Okonkwo smiled and said that was a good sign, that the surgery had relieved the worst pressure. Now they just had to kill the infection and let him heal. He left orders for continued IV antibiotics and clear liquids if Caleb felt up to eating. Then he turned to us and said we'd made the right call bringing him in when we did. Another few hours and this could have been much worse. I called the school that morning and spoke to the principal, Mr. Vasquez, explained what had happened. That Caleb had been in the nurse's office for hours with a ruptured appendix and Nurse Thornton had sent him back to class multiple times. That she'd discouraged me from picking him up, that she'd called his pain dramatic and attention-seeking. Mr. Vasquez was silent for a long moment. Then he said he was very sorry to hear about Caleb's surgery and hoped for a speedy recovery. I asked what would be done about Nurse Thornton's negligence. He said he'd look into the situation and get back to me. I asked when. He said soon. That was it. No timeline. No acknowledgement that what had happened was unacceptable. Just vague promises to look into it. I hung up feeling sick. Asha said we should call a lawyer. I agreed. We needed someone who understood medical malpractice and educational liability. That afternoon, Caleb developed a complication. His fever spiked to 104, and he started vomiting. The nurses ran labs and called Dr. Okonkwo immediately. He ordered another CT scan. The results showed an abscess forming in Caleb's pelvis, a pocket of infection that the antibiotics weren't reaching. He'd need another procedure. They'd insert a drain through his skin to remove the infected fluid. It would be done under sedation, but it was painful and carried its own risks. Asha started crying. I held her while Dr. Okonkwo explained the procedure in detail. He said this kind of complication wasn't uncommon with ruptured appendicitis, but it meant Caleb's recovery would be longer, potentially weeks instead of days. And there was still risk of sepsis if the infection spread to his bloodstream. They'd be watching him very carefully. They did the drain placement that evening. Caleb was sedated but not fully under anesthesia. He cried when they inserted the tube through his side. I had to leave the room because watching him in pain and knowing it was preventable was destroying me. Asha stayed with him, held his hand, talked him through it. When it was over, they brought him back to his room with a tube protruding from his abdomen connected to a collection bag. The bag filled with dark, cloudy fluid, infected material that had been sitting in his belly. Dr. Okonkwo checked the drain output and said it was working well. This should help, but Caleb would need to keep it in for several days at minimum, possibly longer depending on how the infection responded to treatment. Caleb looked at me with exhausted eyes. When can I go home? I didn't have an answer. The lawyer's name was Simone Warren. She practiced medical malpractice and personal injury law downtown. Her assistant fit us in for a consultation 3 days later when Asha's mother could sit with Caleb at the hospital. We drove to her office with a folder full of medical records we'd requested from both the hospital and the school. Simone was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to our story without interrupting. Then she asked questions. Specific questions about timing and what Nurse Thornton had said and what documentation existed. We showed her the medical records, the timestamps from the school call, the CT scan showing the ruptured appendix, Dr. Okonkwo's surgical notes documenting that the rupture had occurred hours before surgery. Simone read everything carefully. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at us. You have a case. A strong one. This is clear negligence. She explained that school nurses had a duty of care to students. That duty included proper assessment of medical complaints and appropriate referral to emergency services when necessary. Nurse Thornton had failed on both counts. She'd inadequately assessed Caleb, dismissed his symptoms without proper evaluation, discouraged parental intervention, and allowed a serious medical condition to worsen for hours. The consequences were documented. Additional surgery, complications, extended hospitalization, ongoing medical expenses, pain, and suffering. Simone said we could file suit against both Nurse Thornton personally and the school district for negligent supervision. But she warned us. These cases took time, years sometimes. The defense would argue that appendicitis is unpredictable, that Nurse Thornton had followed standard protocols, that schools can't send every kid with a stomachache to the ER. We'd need expert testimony from other school nurses saying what she did fell below the standard of care. I asked if we should file a complaint with the state nursing board. Simone said absolutely. That was separate from the lawsuit, but equally important. Professional discipline could result in Nurse Thornton losing her license or facing restrictions on her practice. Simone's assistant gave us the paperwork and website information. We could file online. I asked what else we could do. Simone said document everything, keep all medical records, track all expenses related to Caleb's care, write down everything we remembered from our interactions with Nurse Thornton, get statements from any witnesses. She asked if anyone else had been in the nurse's office when we picked up Caleb or when he'd been there earlier. I said I didn't know. Simone made a note to request the nurse's office logs showing all students who'd been seen that day. If other parents had similar experiences, that would establish a pattern of negligence. We filed the nursing board complaint that night from the hospital. It was a long, detailed form asking for specific information about the incident. Date, time, location, names of everyone involved, description of what happened and why we believed it constituted professional misconduct. I typed out everything I remembered. Every word Nurse Thornton had said, every dismissive comment about Caleb being dramatic, every discouragement about taking him to the ER. The complaint asked what harm had resulted. I attached Dr. Okonkwo's surgical report, the CT images showing the ruptured appendix and peritonitis, the records of the abscess and drain placement, the ongoing hospitalization now stretching into day 6. I hit submit and felt a small measure of relief. Someone outside the school district would review what happened. Someone would hold Nurse Thornton accountable. Caleb came home after 9 days in the hospital. He was weak and pale. The drain was still in place. We'd have to manage it at home until his follow-up appointment in a week. The home health nurse came by to teach us how to empty the collection bag and clean the insertion site. Caleb hated it. Hated the tube sticking out of his side. Hated that he couldn't run or play. Hated that he'd missed 2 weeks of school, including the solar system presentation he'd been excited about. Mira tried to cheer him up by helping him build the model of Saturn he'd been working on, but he didn't have the energy. Just lay on the couch watching TV and dozing. Dr. Okonkwo said this level of fatigue was normal after major infection and multiple procedures. That recovery would be slow, that we needed to be patient. But watching my normally energetic son barely able to stay awake broke my heart. The school principal called a week after Caleb came home. Mr. Vasquez said he'd completed his investigation into the incident. He'd spoken with Nurse Thornton and reviewed her documentation. He wanted us to know that she'd followed all district protocols for assessing students with abdominal complaints, that she'd taken Caleb's temperature, which was normal, that she'd asked about vomiting, which he hadn't done at that point, that she'd offered him water and a place to rest. According to district policy, those steps constituted adequate care. He said he understood our frustration, but that appendicitis symptoms can be vague and difficult to distinguish from common stomach upset. That Nurse Thornton couldn't have known it was serious without diagnostic tools she wasn't trained or equipped to use. He said no disciplinary action would be taken. Nurse Thornton would remain in her position. He hoped we understood. I didn't understand. I asked about the 6 hours Caleb had been in her office, about her multiple dismissals when he asked to go home, about her telling me I was being overprotective and teaching him attention-seeking behavior. Mr. Vasquez said those were professional judgments made in real time with the information available. That hindsight made them look worse than they were. That we couldn't hold school nurses to the same standard as emergency room doctors. They were there to handle minor issues and refer serious ones. Nurse Thornton had believed this was minor. She'd been wrong, but being wrong wasn't the same as being negligent. I asked if he'd reviewed the nurse's office logs to see if other students had similar experiences. He said those records were confidential and not relevant to our situation. I told him we'd filed a lawsuit. There was a long silence. Then he said he was sorry we felt that was necessary, that the district would defend their employees vigorously. He hung up. Asha and I talked long into the night about whether we were doing the right thing. Filing suit would make us pariahs in the school community. Parents would take sides. Some would support us. Others would see us as troublemakers trying to blame the school for bad luck. Mira would face social consequences. Kids would hear their parents talking about the lawsuit and repeat things at school. But when I thought about Nurse Thornton still in that office, still dismissing kids' symptoms, still telling parents not to overreact, I knew we had to proceed. Not just for Caleb, but for every other child who'd walk through that door with something more serious than a scraped knee. Asha agreed. We called Simone the next morning and told her to move forward with filing the lawsuit. She said she'd have papers drawn up within 2 weeks. We were officially going to court. The nursing board sent a letter 6 weeks after we filed the complaint. They'd reviewed our submission and determined there was sufficient evidence to open a formal investigation. Nurse Thornton would be notified and given an opportunity to respond. The investigation would include reviewing her employment records, interviewing witnesses, and examining the medical evidence. The process could take several months. In the meantime, the board couldn't discuss the specifics of the investigation with us due to confidentiality rules, but they'd notify us of the outcome once the case was resolved. It wasn't much, but it was something. An official acknowledgement that what happened warranted scrutiny. I shared the letter with Simone. She said it would help our civil case. If the nursing board found professional misconduct, that would carry weight with a jury. Caleb went back to school after 4 weeks at home. He was still weak and couldn't participate in PE. The drain had finally been removed, but he had a scar on his side and residual tenderness that made running painful. Mrs. Yates was kind and understanding. She let him work at his own pace and gave him extensions on missed assignments, but other staff were distant. Word had spread about the lawsuit. Some teachers openly sided with Nurse Thornton. They'd see me at pickup and turn away. The school secretary who'd taken my call that first day wouldn't make eye contact. One afternoon, a mother confronted me in the parking lot, said I was trying to ruin a good nurse's career over a situation that was nobody's fault. That appendicitis happens and sometimes it ruptures, and that doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. I told her Nurse Thornton had kept my son at school for 6 hours with a ruptured appendix. She said I was exaggerating, that the school wouldn't have let that happen. Discovery started 3 months after we filed suit. Simone requested all of Nurse Thornton's personnel records, training certifications, prior complaints, documentation from the day Caleb was in her office. The district fought every request, claimed personnel files were confidential, that training records weren't relevant, that the nurses' office logs were protected by FERPA because they contained information about other students. Simone filed motions to compel. The judge ruled mostly in our favor. The district had to produce the documents with other students' names redacted. When the files arrived, they were revealing. Nurse Thornton had been at Oak Ridge Elementary for 23 years, like she'd said, but she'd also had 4 prior complaints from parents. None had resulted in discipline. The complaints described similar patterns: dismissing symptoms, sending sick kids back to class, discouraging parents from picking up their children. One complaint from 3 years ago involved a child with a broken arm. Nurse Thornton had said it was just bruised, sent the kid back to class. The arm was fractured in 2 places. Simone also deposed Nurse Thornton. I wasn't allowed in the room, but Asha went. She came back looking shaken, said Nurse Thornton had been calm and confident throughout, maintained she'd done nothing wrong, said she'd assessed Caleb appropriately given the information available, that his temperature was normal, that he hadn't exhibited signs of surgical emergency, that stomach complaints were common in elementary students and usually resolved on their own. When asked why she'd discouraged me from picking him up, she said she was trying to prevent unnecessary disruption to his education. When asked about calling him dramatic and attention-seeking, she said she didn't recall using those exact words. When confronted with my statement that she had, she said I was probably misremembering in my emotional state. When shown Dr. Okonkwo's report indicating the appendix had ruptured around noon, she said that was unfortunate, but unpredictable. That even emergency room doctors miss appendicitis sometimes. That holding a school nurse to a higher standard than physicians was unreasonable. Simone deposed the school secretary next, the woman who'd taken my initial call. She remembered the conversation, said I'd sounded concerned but not panicked, that Nurse Thornton had told her to inform me Caleb was fine and didn't need to go home. When asked if Nurse Thornton had examined Caleb before making that determination, the secretary said she assumed so but didn't know for certain. When asked if the school had protocols for when to call parents about medical issues, she said yes. Nurses were supposed to call for fever over 100, vomiting, suspected broken bones, or uncontrolled bleeding. Abdominal pain wasn't on the list unless the student was vomiting or had fever. So according to protocol, Nurse Thornton hadn't been required to call me at all. The fact that she had someone notify me was actually going above and beyond the minimum requirement. Simone asked if the secretary thought those protocols were adequate. The secretary said she wasn't qualified to judge medical policy. The defense filed a motion for summary judgment 4 months into the case. Their argument was straightforward. Nurse Thornton had followed all established protocols. She'd assessed Caleb multiple times throughout the afternoon. His vital signs were normal. He exhibited no red flag symptoms that would indicate surgical emergency. Appendicitis is notoriously difficult to diagnose, especially in children. Medical literature showed that even experienced emergency physicians missed it in 15 to 20% of cases. Expecting a school nurse with limited training and no diagnostic equipment to identify it was unreasonable. The fact that Caleb's appendix ruptured was unfortunate, but not the result of negligence. The defense cited case law supporting immunity for school employees exercising professional judgment. They argued our case should be dismissed before trial. Simone filed opposition papers, attached expert declarations from 3 school nurses who reviewed the timeline and said Nurse Thornton's care fell below the acceptable standard, that keeping a child with worsening abdominal pain at school for 6 hours without parental consultation or medical referral was negligent, regardless of vital signs. The judge scheduled oral arguments on the summary judgment motion. Simone argued that the evidence showed gross negligence, not mere professional judgment, that Nurse Thornton had minimized Caleb's symptoms, dismissed parental concern, and failed to appreciate the severity of his condition, despite multiple opportunities to intervene, that 6 hours was an unreasonable delay, that her documented history of similar complaints showed a pattern of inadequate care. The defense attorney argued that second-guessing a school nurse's real-time decisions based on hindsight was improper, that the protocols existed for a reason, that deviating from protocols could expose schools to liability, that if nurses sent every kid with a stomach ache to the ER, they'd be sued for overreaction and wasting healthcare resources. The judge took the matter under submission. 3 weeks later, the ruling came down. The motion was denied. Our case would proceed to trial. The judge's written order stated that reasonable jurors could differ on whether Nurse Thornton's conduct met the standard of care, that credibility determinations and conflicting expert testimony required a trial. We'd survived the first major hurdle. The nursing board investigation concluded around the same time. We received a letter with their findings. After thorough review, the board had determined that Nurse Thornton's care of Caleb fell below professional standards. Specifically, she'd failed to adequately monitor a student with persistent and worsening symptoms, failed to consult with parents when a student made multiple requests to go home, and failed to recognize signs that required urgent medical evaluation. The board imposed sanctions. Nurse Thornton would be placed on probationary status for 2 years. She'd be required to complete continuing education courses in pediatric emergency assessment. Her practice would be monitored through regular audits and supervisor reports. If she violated probation or had additional complaints, her license could be suspended or revoked. It was something, not as much as we'd hoped, not license suspension or revocation, but official acknowledgement that what she'd done was wrong. We forwarded the board's findings to Simone. She said they were gold for trial, showed that even the regulatory body responsible for nursing standards found her care deficient. The school district's response to the nursing board findings was to quietly transfer Nurse Thornton to a different school. Not terminated, not suspended, just moved to another elementary school across town where parents didn't know her history. When I found out through a parent who had connections in the district office, I was furious. I called Mr. Vasquez and asked why she was still employed. He said the district stood by their employees, that the nursing board's sanctions were administrative and didn't constitute grounds for termination, that Nurse Thornton had been with the district for over 2 decades and had rights as an employee, that moving her to a new assignment was actually more than they were required to do. I told him there were children at that other school whose parents had no idea the nurse treating them had been found negligent by the state licensing board. He said personnel matters were confidential, and he couldn't discuss them further. I hung up and immediately called the local newspaper. If the district wouldn't protect kids, maybe public pressure would. The reporter was a woman named Alicia Grant, who covered education. I told her the whole story, about Caleb's ruptured appendix, about Nurse Thornton's negligence, about the nursing board findings, about the district transferring her to another school instead of firing her. Alicia said she'd look into it. 2 weeks later, her article ran on the front page of the Metro section. School nurse disciplined for negligence transferred to new school, parents unaware. The article detailed everything, used our names with permission, included quotes from Simone about the lawsuit, cited the nursing board's public disciplinary order, and, most damaging, included reactions from parents at Thornton's new school who were shocked and angry they hadn't been informed. One mother said she'd sent her diabetic daughter to the nurse's office just last week. If she'd known about Thornton's history, she'd have gone to the school herself. The district spokesperson gave a bland statement about personnel decisions being made in the best interest of all students. The article changed everything. Local news stations picked it up. Parents started organizing. A group at Thornton's new school demanded her removal. They circulated petitions, showed up at the next school board meeting, filled the public comment period with stories about their interactions with Thornton. One father said she'd sent his son back to class with suspected concussion symptoms after a playground fall. Another mother said Thornton had told her daughter's bee sting allergy wasn't serious enough to warrant keeping an EpiPen at school. The board members sat stone-faced through 2 hours of testimony. At the end, the board president said they'd review the concerns and respond in due course, but they were clearly rattled. The next day, the superintendent issued a statement. Nurse Thornton had been placed on paid administrative leave pending further review. She would not be treating students while the district conducted an internal investigation. It was more progress than we'd made through official channels. Public outrage had accomplished what complaints and lawsuits couldn't. Trial was scheduled for 8 months after we filed suit. Simone spent weeks preparing our case. She'd identified expert witnesses, a pediatric emergency physician who'd testify about the standard of care for assessing abdominal pain in children, A school nurse with 30 years' experience who'd testify that Thornton's conduct fell below professional norms, a child psychologist who'd discuss the long-term psychological impact of Caleb's trauma. Simone also prepared Caleb to testify. He was 10 now, old enough to take the stand and describe what happened. We practiced with him at home, had him tell the story in his own words, about how much it hurt, about asking to go home, about Nurse Thornton telling him he was fine, about being scared when the pain got worse. He cried during practice. Asha wasn't sure he could handle it, but Simone said his testimony would be powerful. Juries connected with children, believed them, felt protective of them. The defense had their own experts. A school nurse who'd worked in the district for 40 years and said protocols were designed to balance caution with practicality. That sending every student with minor complaints to the ER would overwhelm emergency services and traumatize children unnecessarily. A pediatrician who'd testify that appendicitis symptoms can mimic dozens of benign conditions. That even with sophisticated testing, diagnosis is challenging. That expecting a school nurse to identify it based on clinical assessment alone was unrealistic. The defense strategy was clear. Make this about reasonable professional disagreement, about the inherent difficulty of diagnosing appendicitis, about the impossible position school nurses were in trying to triage hundreds of students with limited resources. Make the jury sympathize with Nurse Thornton as a dedicated professional doing her best in a difficult job. Make us look like vengeful parents trying to blame someone for an unfortunate medical event. Jury selection took 2 days. Simone was meticulous, asked detailed questions about potential jurors' experiences with schools and healthcare, struck anyone with close ties to education or strong anti-lawsuit views. The final jury was 8 people, 5 women, 3 men, mix of ages and backgrounds. 2 had school-age children. 1 was a retired teacher but said she could be impartial. The judge gave preliminary instructions, explained the burden of proof, told jurors to base their verdict only on evidence presented at trial, no outside research, no discussing the case until deliberations. Then we began. Simone's opening statement was direct. She told Caleb's story chronologically. The stomach pain starting at school, the multiple visits to Nurse Thornton, the 6-hour delay, the ruptured appendix, the complications. She showed the jury photos of Caleb in the hospital with tubes and drains, showed them the medical bills totaling over $80,000, told them this wasn't about a difficult diagnosis. It was about a nurse who ignored clear warning signs and parental concern because she thought she knew better. The defense's opening painted a different picture. Nurse Thornton was a dedicated professional with over 2 decades of experience. She'd seen thousands of students, helped countless children. On the day in question, she'd assessed Caleb 3 separate times. His temperature was normal, no vomiting, no fever, no red flags that would indicate emergency. She'd offered him water, rest, and compassion. When his father insisted on picking him up, she'd shared her professional opinion that it wasn't necessary, but hadn't prevented it. Caleb got the care he needed. Yes, his appendix ruptured. Yes, that was serious. But ruptured appendix happens. It's not always preventable, and it's certainly not the fault of a school nurse doing her job with the limited tools and training available. The defense attorney said this case was about perspective, about understanding that school nurses aren't doctors, they're triage professionals, and Nurse Thornton had triaged appropriately given what she knew at the time. We testified first. I described the phone call from school, the casual dismissal, arriving to find Caleb in agony, Nurse Thornton's insistence that he was being dramatic, her discouragement when I said I was taking him to the ER. The defense attorney cross-examined aggressively, asked if I'd told Nurse Thornton that Caleb's sister had appendicitis previously. I said no, I hadn't thought to mention it. He suggested that information would have changed Thornton's assessment, that I'd withheld relevant medical history. I said I didn't think a family history of appendicitis was something I needed to report for a stomachache. He asked if I had medical training. I said no. He asked how I knew it was appendicitis when I first got the call. I said I didn't know for certain. I just knew my son needed medical attention. He suggested I was retroactively ascribing certainty I hadn't felt at the time, making Nurse Thornton's caution look negligent when actually she'd been reasonably skeptical of a parent's panic. Asha testified next, described Caleb's personality, his love of school, how unlike him it was to complain. The defense attorney asked if she'd been at the school that day. She said no. He asked if she'd spoken to Nurse Thornton. She said no. He suggested her testimony was based entirely on second-hand information from me and Caleb, that she had no direct knowledge of what happened in the nurse's office. Asha said she had direct knowledge of her son coming home from the hospital with a drain in his side, direct knowledge of his pain and fear, direct knowledge of medical bills that kept coming. The defense attorney said those were consequences of appendicitis, not negligence. Asha's voice shook when she responded. They're consequences of a 6-hour delay in treatment. That's not the same thing. The judge told the jury to disregard the commentary, to focus only on facts. But I saw several jurors nodding at Asha's words. They got it. Dr. Okonkwo testified via video deposition. He walked through his surgical findings, the ruptured appendix, the peritonitis, the abscess that required drainage. When asked about timing, he said based on the inflammation and contamination, The rupture had occurred approximately 6 hours before surgery. Simone asked if earlier intervention would have made a difference. Dr. Okonkwo said if Caleb had been brought to the ER when symptoms first started, they likely would have diagnosed appendicitis before rupture. Pre-rupture appendectomy was far less complicated. Lower risk of infection and complications, shorter recovery. But once rupture occurred, the damage was done. The defense attorney asked if Dr. Okonkwo could say with medical certainty that the appendix would not have ruptured regardless of timing. He said no, he couldn't guarantee that. Appendicitis progresses at different rates. Some rupture within hours. But standard medical practice was to treat suspected appendicitis urgently for exactly this reason, to minimize rupture risk. Our expert school nurse testified in person. Her name was Dorothy Brennan, 65 years old, worked as a school nurse for 35 years before retiring. Simone walked her through Nurse Thornton's documentation from that day. Dorothy pointed out deficiencies. Thornton had noted Caleb's complaints, but hadn't documented any follow-up assessment. No notation of pain scale, no description of pain location or characteristics, no assessment of whether pain was improving or worsening. 3 separate entries just saying, student resting in office. Dorothy said adequate nursing documentation would include ongoing assessment, noting changes in condition, consulting with parents when symptoms persisted. She testified that keeping a child with persistent abdominal pain at school for 6 hours without parental consultation or medical referral fell below the standard of care, that Thornton's dismissal of parental concern was particularly problematic. Parents knew their children. When a parent expressed worry about their child's symptoms, nurses should take that seriously. The defense attorney challenged Dorothy's testimony, asked if she'd reviewed the district's protocols. She said yes. He asked if Thornton had followed those protocols. Dorothy said technically yes, she'd taken temperature and asked about vomiting. But protocols were minimum standards, not ceilings. A competent nurse recognized when a situation exceeded protocol and required judgment. He asked if Dorothy had ever sent students home unnecessarily. She said, of course, better to be cautious. He asked if she'd ever had parents complain she was too quick to send kids home. She said yes. He suggested nursing was a no-win situation. Parents complained if you sent kids home, complained if you didn't. Dorothy said that wasn't quite right. Parents wanted nurses to take their children's symptoms seriously, to use clinical judgment, to consult when uncertain. That's not what happened here. This was dismissal. This was assumption that a child and parent were both wrong. That's not nursing. That's gatekeeping. Nurse Thornton testified in her own defense. She wore professional attire and spoke confidently, described her training and experience, said she'd handled thousands of stomach complaints over her career, that most were benign, gas, anxiety, lunch that disagreed with the child. She said Caleb had come to her office at 11:30 complaining of stomach pain. She'd taken his temperature, which was 98.6, asked if he'd vomited. He said no. She'd had him lie down and rest. He'd returned to class at 12:15, came back at 1:00 saying it still hurt. She'd reassessed. Temperature still normal. No vomiting. She'd given him water and crackers. Let him rest until 1:45 when she sent him back to class again. He'd come back a third time at 2:30. At that point, she'd called the office to notify his parent. She said when I arrived, I'd seemed anxious and overprotective, that she'd tried to reassure me it was likely nothing serious, that she may have suggested waiting to see if symptoms resolved, but ultimately I'd insisted on taking him home, and she hadn't prevented it. Simone's cross-examination was surgical. She asked Nurse Thornton if she'd documented Caleb's pain level. Thornton said she'd assessed it clinically. Simone asked what clinical signs indicated the pain level. Thornton said he was able to walk and talk. Simone asked if someone could walk and talk while experiencing serious medical emergency. Thornton hesitated, said in theory yes, but typically serious pain would render a child unable to function normally. Simone showed security footage from the hallway outside the nurse's office timestamped 2:40 that afternoon. It showed me helping Caleb walk. He was hunched over, moving slowly, clearly in distress. She asked if that looked like someone functioning normally. Thornton said she hadn't seen him in the hallway, only in her office where he'd been lying quietly. Simone asked if lying quietly might indicate a child was in too much pain to move. Thornton said it could also indicate a child was resting comfortably. Simone pulled out the nursing board's disciplinary order, asked Thornton if she'd been found to have violated professional standards. Thornton said she'd been placed on probation, but disagreed with the board's findings, said she'd followed her training. Simone asked if 4 other parents had filed complaints about her care in previous years. The defense attorney objected, said prior complaints were irrelevant and prejudicial. The judge allowed it, said it went to pattern of conduct. Thornton admitted there had been complaints, but said parents always blamed the nurse when their child got hurt or sick at school, that she couldn't be held responsible for every parent's dissatisfaction. Simone asked about the child with the broken arm she'd diagnosed as a bruise. Thornton said x-rays weren't available in school settings, that she'd made her best assessment. Simone asked if that child had been in pain. Thornton said yes. Simone asked if Thornton had sent the child home or called the parents. Thornton said no, said broken bones and bruises both cause pain, that she couldn't send every child with pain to the ER. Simone let that answer sit with the jury, didn't ask another question, just said no further questions and sat down. The defense called their school nurse expert. She testified that district protocols were reasonable and that Thornton had followed them, that school nurses had to balance caution with practicality, that Thornton's documentation showed appropriate assessment. Our pediatric ER physician expert testified that Caleb's presentation, persistent and worsening abdominal pain over 6 hours, required medical evaluation, that while appendicitis diagnosis could be challenging, the appropriate response to diagnostic uncertainty was referral, not reassurance, that keeping a child at school with those symptoms constituted a delay in care. The defense's pediatrician testified that appendicitis symptoms varied widely, that Thornton couldn't have known without imaging, that hindsight bias made her caution look negligent when actually it was reasonable. Back and forth, expert against expert, dueling interpretations of the same facts. Closing arguments took most of a day. Simone reminded the jury of Caleb's testimony, a 9-year-old boy in agony begging to go home, being told he was fine. She reminded them of the timeline, 6 hours from first complaint to finally leaving school. She reminded them of Dr. Okonkwo's testimony that the appendix ruptured during those 6 hours, that earlier intervention would have prevented rupture. She reminded them of Dorothy Brennan's testimony that Thornton's care fell below nursing standards. She reminded them of the nursing board's findings, professional discipline for inadequate care. She asked them to hold Nurse Thornton accountable, to send a message that children's pain matters, that parental concern matters, that school nurses can't dismiss serious symptoms just because they're difficult to diagnose. She asked for compensatory damages covering medical expenses, pain and suffering, and future care, and she asked for punitive damages, to punish Thornton's callous disregard and deter similar conduct. The defense's closing painted us as opportunistic parents looking for someone to blame, said appendicitis was a medical event, not negligence, that Nurse Thornton had done her job, that we wanted to punish her for being cautious when her caution was appropriate given the information available, that school nurses deserved support, not lawsuits, that holding Thornton liable would have a chilling effect, would make nurses afraid to exercise judgment, would result in overwhelming emergency rooms with false alarms, would harm the very students we claimed to want to protect. The attorney asked the jury to find for the defense, to acknowledge that sometimes bad outcomes happen despite everyone's best efforts, that sympathy for Caleb didn't equal proof of negligence, that our burden was proof, not emotion, and we hadn't met it. The jury deliberated for 2 days. We waited at Simone's office, couldn't focus on anything, just refreshed our phones, constantly checking for updates. On the afternoon of the second day, we got the call. Verdict was in. We had 20 minutes to get to the courthouse. We arrived breathless and took our seats. The jury filed in looking exhausted. The judge asked if they'd reached a verdict. The foreperson said yes. The clerk read the verdict form. On the question of whether Nurse Thornton had breached the standard of care, the jury found yes. On the question of whether that breach caused Caleb's injuries, the jury found yes. On the question of damages, the jury awarded $340,000 in compensatory damages and $150,000 in punitive damages. Asha grabbed my hand. I couldn't breathe. We'd won. The judge thanked the jury and dismissed them. Thornton sat motionless at the defense table. Her attorney was already filing papers for appeal. Outside the courtroom, Simone said the defense would absolutely appeal, that it would take months, that they might settle to avoid the uncertainty. But we'd won the hardest part. A jury had heard the evidence and agreed Thornton was negligent, that Caleb's injuries were preventable, that accountability mattered. Reporters were waiting outside. Alicia Grant from the newspaper, local TV crews. I gave a brief statement, said we'd pursued this case not for money, but for justice, to make sure what happened to Caleb didn't happen to other children, that school nurses had an obligation to take children's pain seriously, that Nurse Thornton had failed that obligation and must be held accountable. A reporter asked if I had regrets about the lawsuit. I said my only regret was that the system forced us to sue to get anyone to care. The school district settled 2 weeks later. They didn't want the publicity of an appeal, didn't want more news coverage of Nurse Thornton's negligence. They paid the full judgment plus our attorney fees, and they agreed to policy changes. All school nurses would receive enhanced training in pediatric emergency assessment. Protocols would be revised to require parental consultation when students made repeated complaints about the same symptom. Nurse offices would maintain detailed assessment logs. And most importantly, the district agreed to terminate Nurse Thornton's employment. She wouldn't be working with children in any capacity in the district again. It was over, truly over. Caleb was 12 now. The scar on his side had faded. He played soccer again, got straight A's, never talked about what happened unless asked. The money went into a trust for his future, college, medical expenses if needed, whatever he wanted. We moved on, but we never forgot what it took to get justice, and I never stopped checking on him when he said something hurt. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.